In the shadowed hollows of West Virginia's forgotten hills, where the mist clings to the pines like a shroud and the wind whispers secrets through cracked cabin walls, stood the Whitaker house, a ramshackle monument to decay, its sagging porch groaning under the weight of untold years. No road led directly to it, only a overgrown path, choked with brambles that seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers, as if the land itself conspired to keep intruders at bay. Folks in the nearest town, a cluster of weathered storefronts 20 miles down the valley, spoke of the Whitakers in hushed tones over flickering neon at the diner, their eyes darting as if the name alone could summon shadows. They were the most isolated souls in America, bound by blood that ran too thick, too intertwined, in ways that twisted both body and mind. No one ever left that house, not truly. Rumors swirled of those who tried, only to vanish into the fog or return broken, mumbling of things that lurked in the mirrors and the bloodlines. It was said the family had dwelled there since the Civil War, marrying kin to kin in a desperate bid to preserve some ancient purity, but what emerged was something far darker, a living labyrinth of madness where escape was not just impossible, but unthinkable. And on a rain-slicked autumn evening, when the leaves bled red under a bruised sky, a stranger arrived at the threshold, drawn by the pull of a story that promised to unravel the very fabric of human endurance. Little did they know, the door creaked open not to welcome, but to ensnare. The first time anyone from the outside world laid eyes on the Whitaker place in 37 years, it was by accident. A freelance photographer named Mara Ellison had been chasing autumn color for a magazine spread, driving deeper into Odd County than any assignment required, following a nameless dirt spur that Google Maps refused to acknowledge. The Jeep's tires spun in red clay until the road simply surrendered, swallowed by kudzu and laurel. She got out to stretch, camera slung around her neck, and that was when the wind shifted, carrying the smell of wood smoke and something coppery underneath. 50 yards ahead, half hidden by a stand of black locusts, the house appeared like a bruise against the hillside. 2 stories, though the second leaned so severely it seemed held up by memory alone. Windows stared out like cataract eyes, some boarded, others gaping voids where the glass had long since fallen inward. The siding, once white, had gone the grey of old bone, streaked with decades of soot from the leaning chimney that coughed a thin ribbon of smoke into the low sky. Porch boards bowed under invisible weight, one corner of the roof had collapsed entirely, leaving a jagged mouth open to the elements. Yet the place was alive. A single yellow bulb burned behind a downstairs curtain, and on the porch sat a child, or what should have been a child, rocking in slow, mechanical rhythm. The head was too large, the limbs too thin, fingers splayed like spider legs against the rail as it stared straight at Mara with eyes the pale blue of spoiled milk. She raised her camera instinctively. The shutter clicked once, twice, before the child's mouth opened in a soundless O. Then another figure emerged from the shadowed doorway behind it, taller, broader, dressed in a colorless shift that might once have been a nightgown. The face was wrong in ways the lens struggled to capture, jaw too narrow, forehead sloping sharply, skin mottled with sores that never quite healed. It lifted one hand, not in greeting, but in warning, palm out, fingers fused at the tips into something almost hoof-like. Mara's breath fogged in the sudden cold. Somewhere inside the house, a chorus of voices rose, not words, but a low, wet humming that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The photographer took one involuntary step backward, thorns tearing at her jeans, and in that moment she understood this was no forgotten homestead lost to poverty. This was a place the world had deliberately turned its back on, a place that had turned inward so completely it had begun to devour itself from the inside out. The child on the porch never blinked. The figure in the doorway never moved again. But the humming grew louder, threading through the trees, until Mara felt it inside her own ribs, calling her forward even as every instinct screamed to run. Mara drove away with the Jeep fishtailing in the mud, the taste of iron in her mouth from where she had bitten her tongue. By the time she reached the single stoplight town of Odd, the sun had already bled out behind the ridges, and the photographs on her camera's screen looked like stills from a nightmare someone else had dreamed. She sat in the parking lot of the Shut Up and Eat diner, scrolling through the images again and again, zooming in on the fused fingers, the milky stare, the impossible proportions of skull and limb. The waitress who refilled her coffee without being asked took one look at the glow of the screen and crossed herself, muttering Lord Jesus under her breath before hurrying away. That night, in a cinderblock motel whose sign flickered VAC NCY in dying pink neon, Mara couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes she heard the humming, felt it vibrating behind her sternum like a second heartbeat. She opened her laptop and started digging. The Whitakers, Odd County, West Virginia. The search returned almost nothing at first, just a 2004 soft news piece about America's most inbred family, a grainy YouTube clip from a British tabloid crew that had been run off the mountain with buckshot, a few message board threads that dissolved into racist jokes and dead links. But buried in a defunct genealogy forum she found a scanned 1930 census page, 12 Whitakers living at the same address, all sharing 3 surnames among them. A later note, typed by some long-gone moderator, read simply, "Family still present as of 1987. Local authorities will not discuss." By 3 in the morning she had pieced together fragments, a 1970s welfare report mentioning severe congenital anomalies, a sheriff's log from 1994 about a teenage girl found wandering the highway barefoot and mute who was returned to the house within hours, a single academic paper on Appalachian genetic isolation that cited the Whitakers anonymously as the most extreme documented case of multigenerational consanguinity in the United States. The phrase lodged in her mind like a splinter, multigenerational consanguinity. Not poverty, not ignorance, something deliberate, sustained, almost ritualistic. Mara stared at the dark window, seeing her own reflection superimposed over the black hills beyond. She had spent 10 years chasing stories of human extremity, child soldiers in Congo, cult compounds in Oregon, narco shrines in Sinaloa, always believing the worst thing a person could do was look away. Now the worst thing felt like a hook in her gut. She booked the same room for another week, bought a better map, a heavier jacket, a voice recorder with fresh batteries. Whatever was happening up that forgotten spur wasn't just a story. It was a question no one had dared answer. How does an entire family disappear inside its own blood while the rest of the world pretends not to notice? She zipped the camera into its bag, heart hammering with the particular clarity that comes before stepping off a cliff. She was going back. Not as a tourist with a lens, but as someone who needed to understand why no one, not the sheriff, not the church, the state, the neighbors 20 miles down the valley, had ever dragged those people into the light. The humming in her chest grew louder, almost approving. As the decision settled into her bones, Mara returned at dawn, when the mist rose off the hollow like steam from a grave. She parked a quarter-mile away and walked the rest, boots silent on the wet leaves, recorder running in her coat pocket. The house looked worse in the pale light, as though night had been the only thing keeping it upright. A single crow sat on the collapsed roofline, head cocked, watching her approach with one obsidian eye. She was still 20 yards out when the screen door creaked open. The figure that stepped onto the porch was the tall one from the photograph, the woman in the shapeless shift. Up close the deformities were merciless, the lower jaw receding into almost nothing, exposing teeth that grew in every direction like yellowed piano keys, eyes set too far apart, one drifting lazily while the other fixed on Mara with startling intensity. The woman's hands hung at her sides, the fused fingers curled like dried roots. She smelled of wood smoke, urine, and something sweet-rotten underneath. Mara raised both palms, empty. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," she said, voice steadier than she felt. "I just want to talk." The woman tilted her head. A sound came out, not words, but a wet click deep in the throat, followed by a low moan that rose and fell like a siren winding down. From inside the house came answering noises, shuffling feet, a heavy thump, a child's high-pitched keen. The woman lifted one deformed hand and pointed at Mara, then at the porch boards beneath her own bare, calloused feet. The message was unmistakable: "Stay there." Mara obeyed. The crow took flight, wings beating slow and deliberate. Seconds later a second figure appeared in the doorway behind the woman, an old man, spine curved into a question mark, face a map of overlapping tumors and open sores. He wore overalls so patched they looked quilted. His mouth worked soundlessly until a single syllable escaped, cracked and ancient, "Git." The woman turned and hissed at him, sharp as a whip crack. He shrank back, but not before Mara saw the family resemblance carved into every malformed bone. The woman faced Mara again. This time she opened her mouth wider and Mara saw the tongue, swollen, black at the tip, forked almost, before the woman closed it with visible effort. She took one step forward, then another, until she stood at the edge of the porch. Up close her breath was furnace-hot and sour. She raised her ruined hand and pressed 2 fused fingers against Mara's sternum, right where the humming still lived. Her drifting eye rolled white. She leaned in until their foreheads nearly touched and whispered a single word, the consonants chewed and spat out, blood, nose. Then she smiled, a stretching of lips over too many teeth, and the sound that followed was not laughter but something older, wetter, triumphant. Behind her the doorway filled with more shapes, pale faces, swollen skulls, limbs too long or too short, watching, waiting, humming in perfect, terrible unison. Mara left the porch only because the woman finally stepped aside and pointed toward the sagging barn 50 yards downhill. Its tin roof rusted the color of dried blood. The gesture was not an invitation but a command, and the humming followed her all the way across the muddy yard like a leash made of sound. Inside the barn the air was thick with mouse nests and coal dust. Weak light leaked through knotholes, striping a makeshift table fashioned from a door laid across sawhorses. On it sat a single object, a wooden trunk bound with iron straps green with age. The woman, whose name, Mara would later learn, was Lorna, lifted the lid with surprising strength. Inside were hundreds of papers, some brittle as dead leaves, others warped by damp, birth certificates, marriage licenses, a family Bible whose leather cover had been gnawed by rats, pages swollen and bleeding ink. Mara's fingers trembled as she spread them across the table. The earliest entry was 1863, Elias Whittaker marrying his first cousin Ruth Coldiron in a ceremony performed by a traveling preacher who noted in the margin, "Against my counsel." From there the tree folded in on itself like a snake eating its tail. Brothers married sisters. Uncles took nieces. A man listed as both father and grandfather to the same child. By 1910 the surnames had collapsed into only 2, Whittaker and Coldiron, used interchangeably, as if the family had decided names themselves were an extravagance. Handwritten notes in different inks, different hands, appeared beside certain births. Tongue cleft, eyes fused, born with tail removed by Pa, lived 3 days speaking backward. One crumbling ledger, kept in a child's careful scrawl, recorded every pregnancy since 1932. Beside each name was a column marked kept or taken. Far more were kept. A yellowed newspaper clipping from 1957 showed a state trooper standing in this same yard, caption reading authorities remove 4 children from isolated clan, governor promises intervention. On the reverse, someone had scrawled in red pencil, they brung 'em back by nightfall. Sheriff said blood stays where blood belongs. At the very bottom of the trunk lay a single photograph, edges curled, taken perhaps in the 1940s. 23 Whittakers posed in front of the house, every face bearing the same sloping brow, the same too wide stare. In the back row stood a man in a dark suit, the only outsider, his features sharp and unmarred. Someone had scratched his eyes out with a nail. Beneath the photo, in handwriting Mara now recognized as Lorna's, blocky, Laborde, was written a single sentence that crawled under the skin. He tried to thin the blood. "We fixed him. House keeps what's its." Lorna closed the trunk with a thud that scattered dust like ash. She placed her deformed palm over the lid as if sealing a grave and looked at Mara with something that might have been pity, in another life, maternal pride. The humming rose again, louder now, coming not just from Lorna's throat but from the barn walls, the rusted tin, the very ground beneath their feet. That night Mara slept in her Jeep with the windows cracked, engine ticking as it cooled, too afraid to drive back to the motel and too stubborn to leave the hollow entirely. Around 3 a.m. the rain started, soft at first, then hard enough to drum the roof like impatient fingers. She woke with her eyes open in the dark, the family Bible's pages still burning behind her eyelids, when the passenger door opened by itself. Lorna slid in without a sound, bringing the smell of wet earth and something metallic. Water streamed from her thin hair and the hem of her shift, pooling on the seat. She didn't speak. She simply reached across and pressed 2 fused fingers to Mara's forehead, right at the hairline. The touch was fever-hot. Instantly the rain stopped sounding like rain, it became voices, hundreds of them, layered and overlapping, all speaking the same handful of phrases in different stages of life. Stay in the blood, house keeps, never thin, come back, come home. Images followed the voices, not memories but something more intimate, as if Mara's own bloodstream had been hijacked. She saw a circle of Whittaker women in the 1890s, skirts hiked, cutting their palms and letting the blood drip into a tin cup passed hand to hand while a newborn wailed in a cradle made of rifle stocks. She saw a preacher nailed to the barn door in 1921, his tongue pulled out through a slit in his throat because he tried to baptize a child against the family's will. She saw children born with translucent skin and black eyes who were carried at dusk to the ridge and left for the old debt, whatever that was, only to be found the next morning curled asleep on the porch again, unharmed, smiling. The worst vision came last, a little girl, maybe 8, with Lorna's eyes and the same drifting gaze, dragging a burlap sack toward the creek in 1978. Inside the sack something kicked weakly. The girl whispered, I'm sorry, but when she opened it a boy tumbled out, her brother, her cousin, her twin alive, unmarked, laughing as he ran back toward the house. The girl stood alone in the moonlight, sack empty, and began to cry blood that steamed when it hit the cold ground. Over her shoulder the house watched with every lit window, patient as a spider. Lorna removed her fingers. The rain was only rain again. Mara's face was wet, though she hadn't cried. Lorna leaned close enough that Mara could see the fine blue veins under the thin skin of her temple, pulsing too fast. When she spoke her voice was soft, almost tender, the consonants still chewed but understandable now. Curse ain't from God nor devil, she said. Curse is the promise. We keep the blood thick so the house stays fed. Thin it and the house starves. Starve it and it takes everything, land, sky, time. Been hungry since 1863. Won't never stop. She opened the Jeep door. Cold air rushed in, carrying that same sweet rotten smell. Before sliding out she touched Mara's cheek with the back of her ruined hand, almost affectionate. You feel it now, she whispered. It knows you listened. Mara stayed another night in the Jeep, doors locked, windows fogged, telling herself she would leave at first light. But when first light came it was the wrong color, a bruised violet that made the trees look underwater. She stepped out to piss behind a laurel thicket and found her own footprints from the night before already filled with black water that reflected no sky. Inside the house she had not entered yet she was inside. She stood in a hallway that smelled of boiled cabbage and camphor, wallpaper peeling in long yellow tongues. A single bulb swung overhead though there was no breeze. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Whitakers staring out with the same sloping brow, the same two wide eyes, but the paint was still wet. When she blinked, the eyes tracked her. One portrait, a woman in 1920s dress, dripped fresh crimson from the corner of her mouth as if she had just bitten her tongue. She walked, though her body remained outside leaning against the Jeep hood. The floorboards gave like flesh. In the parlor a circle of children sat playing cat's cradle with something pale and fibrous that might once have been an umbilical cord. They looked up in unison and smiled with identical voices said, You're late for supper, Cousin Mara. Their teeth were too sharp, filed or grown that way. One held out a plate of sliced tomatoes swimming in dark syrup. The tomatoes had eyes. Upstairs, a bedroom door stood ajar. Inside, a younger version of herself lay on her knees, mouth sewn shut with black thread, trying to dig a hole through the floorboards with blood-slick fingers. The Mara in the bed looked up, eyes pleading, and managed to force a single word through the stitches, run. The thread snapped, blood sprayed, and the room filled with the sound of wet wings. Down in the root cellar she found the source of the humming. Hundreds of mason jars lined the shelves, each containing a floating tongue, some adult-sized, some no larger than a child's thumb. They pressed against the glass, writhing in perfect synchrony, producing that low, wet chord that never stopped. One jar was empty, lid off, waiting. A label in Lorna's handwriting read simply Mara, 2025. She fled upward through floors that weren't there, past windows showing the same ridge at different centuries, snow in July, fire in December, the house always standing, always hungry. At the attic gable she found a mirror whose silver had gone black. Her reflection stepped forward while she stayed still. The reflection smiled with Lorna's mouth, spoke with her own voice. You think the visions are warnings, it said. They're invitations. The house is only lonely. It wants family the only way it knows how. The reflection reached through the glass. Cold fingers closed around Mara's wrist, and for a moment she felt her bones soften, her jaw begin to ache with the promise of receding, her vision splitting into two drifting fields. Then the crow from the roofline crashed through the attic window, showering glass, and the connection broke. She was outside again, kneeling in the mud, dawn the proper color now, her wrist bruised with perfect fingerprints that were not Lorna's, not human. The humming was quieter, but it lived under her skin now, patient, certain she would answer soon. The girl came at twilight, barefoot, wearing a man's flannel shirt that hung to her knees like a collapsed tent. She couldn't have been more than 16, but her belly swelled round and tight beneath the fabric, skin stretched so thin the blue veins mapped continents. Her face was the least damaged Mara had seen yet, only a slightly crooked jaw and one ear set lower than the other, but her eyes were old, ancient, ringed black from sleeplessness or something worse. She moved fast, half running, half stumbling down the porch steps, clutching a plastic grocery sack that swung heavy against her thigh. Mara was already out of the jeep, camera forgotten, when the girl spotted her. For one heartbeat hope flared bright in those exhausted eyes. The girl veered straight toward her, mouth working around soundless words. Help, please, now. 20 yards, 10, 5, Mara reached out. Then the humming stopped, so completely the sudden silence felt like drowning. The girl froze mid-step as if someone had yanked an invisible chain. Her spine arched backward, neck tendons standing out like cables. A thin, reedy scream tore out of her, rising into something inhuman. From the house came an answering roar, not voices, but the house itself, boards cracking, windows rattling in their frames, chimney stones grinding against one another. The porch light exploded in a shower of sparks. The girl dropped the sack. Cans of Vienna sausage and a half-empty bottle of prenatal vitamins rolled across the mud. She clawed at her own throat, nails leaving bloody furrows, trying to dig something out that wasn't there. Her belly rippled violently, the skin bulging in impossible shapes, as if the thing inside had woken up angry. Mara lunged forward, caught the girl under the arms. She weighed almost nothing, bones like a bird's. Together they staggered 3 steps toward the jeep before the ground buckled. Roots, thick, black, wet, burst up through the soil, wrapping the girl's ankles, her calves, climbing with obscene speed. They weren't roots at all, they were veins, pulsing, dragging her backward. The girl's mouth stretched wide in a silent howl as the veins yanked her flat. Mud splashed over her legs, her hips, her swollen belly. She locked eyes with Mara one last time, pure animal terror, and managed to force a single word through blood-flecked lips: cut. Mara grabbed the folding knife from her pocket, slashed at the thickest tendril. Black sap sprayed, hot as blood, smelling of pennies and rot. The vein severed with a wet pop, but 2 more erupted in its place, looping around the girl's throat now limp arms. From the house Lorna appeared on the porch, arms raised, mouth open in a perfect circle. The humming resumed, deeper, triumphant. The girl was halfway to the porch now, dragged on her back, shirt rucked up, belly exposed and heaving. Mara slashed again, until her hands were slick and the knife slipped from her fingers. The last thing the girl did before the darkness folded over her was reach one trembling hand toward the fallen sack of food, fingers opening and closing on nothing. Then the front door swung wide by itself and the house swallowed her whole, the screen door banging once, twice, like a heartbeat settling back into rhythm. The mud closed over the drag marks as if they had never been. Only the scattered cans remained, glinting dully under the rising moon. Mara drove down the mountain at dawn with the girl's blood still under her fingernails and the taste of sap in her mouth. She went straight to the county courthouse in Odd, a squat brick building that smelled of bleach and mildew. The sheriff's office was locked, blinds drawn, though it was 9:30 on a Tuesday. Through the glass she saw Deputy Hargrove, barely 30, face pockmarked from teenage acne, pretending to study a clipboard while avoiding her eyes. She slammed the counter. A pregnant teenager was just dragged back into that house against her will. I watched it happen. Hargrove's pen stopped moving. You must be mistaken. I have photos. Video. Blood on my clothes. He finally looked up, and the pity in his gaze was worse than indifference. Best you delete those, he said quietly. Folks round here got long memories and short patience. By noon she had learned how deep the silence ran. The clerk at Family Services turned pale when Mara said the name Whitaker and claimed the relevant files had been lost in the '98 flood. The pastor of the little Baptist church closed his office door in her face, muttering about old covenants. Even the cashier at the Dollar General, a woman with a tracheotomy scar and a Trump 2024 cap, hissed, "Ain't your business, Flatlander," when Mara asked if anyone ever checked on the children up there. That evening she sat in the diner nursing burnt coffee and found the proof she hadn't wanted. A retired social worker named Dolores Mead, 81 and half-blind, agreed to talk only if Mara bought her a slice of coconut cream pie and promised never to repeat her name. Between careful bites the old woman laid it out. "Started in the 1930s, she said. State tried to take the kids, found them returned overnight, caseworkers threatened, one found hanged in his own garage ruled suicide though the rope was too short. By the 1950s the county commissioners struck a deal, the Whitakers stay put, marry however they please, birth whatever comes, and in exchange the hollow stays off every map, every census, every welfare roll. Money changed hands, timber rights, mineral rights, a blind eye turned to moonshine stills deeper in the ridges. Even the power company ran lines around the property instead of through it. Every few years a new governor would make noise about intervention, but files vanished, reporters got flat tires in sets of 4, and eventually the story died. "It ain't just family keeping family," Dolores whispered, licking cream from her dentures. "It's the whole damn county feeding the thing one silence at a time. House don't need locks when the world itself stands guard." She slid a yellowed photograph across the table, the same sharp-faced outsider from the trunk portrait, this time shaking hands with a much younger Sheriff Hargrove, same jawline, same eyes. On the back, someone had written 1976, agreement renewed. Dolores patted Mara's wrist with cold, paper-thin fingers. "You go poking that nest, girl, you won't just lose your story. You'll lose the road that brought you here." Outside the diner window, the mountains crouched like animals waiting for night. Mara came back at 2:14 a.m. with a crowbar, a gallon of gasoline, and the kind of clarity that only arrives after every other option has been burned away. She parked at the mouth of the hollow, cut the headlights, and walked the last half-mile in total darkness, guided by the house's single yellow window glowing like an infected eye. She had chosen the girl's window because it was the only one without boards. The pregnant teenager, her name, Mara had learned from a 2009 missing person poster still taped inside the courthouse bathroom, was Raylene, lay on a bare mattress, wrists tied to the iron headboard with baling twine. Her belly rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths. When Mara tapped the glass, Raylene's eyes snapped open, wide and wet and already begging. Mara pried the sash. Wood screamed. Inside, the air was thick with the sweet rotten smell and something sharper, fear, birth fluids, old blood. She sawed the twine with her knife while Raylene whimpered, "They'll know, they always know." The girl's legs were streaked with bruises shaped like handprints, some fresh, some yellowed weeks old. They were halfway across the room when the hallway filled with bodies. Lorna stood at the front, naked now, skin hanging loose over bone, mouth open in that perfect humming O. Behind her crowded the rest, old men with tumor necks, children with translucent eyelids, a boy whose arms bent backward at the elbows. They moved as one organism, slow, deliberate, blocking the stairs. Mara swung the crowbar. It connected with an old man's shoulder, cartilage cracked like green wood. He didn't flinch, only smiled wider. Hands reached, too many hands, catching her hair, her jacket, Raylene's shirt. The girl screamed as she was yanked backward, nightgown tearing away in strips. Lorna stepped forward and pressed her forehead to Mara's, sharing breath that tasted of graves. "Blood remembers," she crooned, and the others echoed it in a wet chorus. Mara shoved the gasoline can into Lorna's chest, soaking the woman's torso, then flicked her lighter. Flame raced up the shift in a blue whoosh. Lorna didn't scream, she laughed, arms spreading as fire licked her face, revealing teeth blackening in the heat. The others recoiled just long enough. Mara dragged Raylene through the window, glass shredding their skin. They hit the ground hard, rolled, came up running. Behind them the house exhaled a roar that shook leaves from the trees. Windows burst outward in showers of flame and burning faces pressed against the fire, mouths open, still humming even as skin slid from bone. They reached the jeep. Raylene collapsed across the back seat, water breaking in a sudden hot flood. Mara floored it, tires spinning mud, the rearview mirror filled with the house blazing like a torch against the black ridge. For one impossible moment every window showed the same silhouette, tall, deformed, arms raised in welcome or warning, before the roof collapsed in a cyclone of sparks. Raylene's first contraction hit as they crested the ridge. Between screams she grabbed Mara's sleeve with surprising strength and gasped, "It's coming fast, and it already knows your name." They made it as far as the county hospital in Beckley before the state troopers took Raylene away for protective custody and Mara for questioning. The obstetrician who delivered the baby, a boy, 8 pounds, perfect APGAR, no visible deformities, refused to let Mara into the room, muttering about infection risk and court orders. Mara sat in the corridor until dawn, arms wrapped around herself, listening to the newborn's thin, furious cry echo down the hallway like an accusation. When they finally let her see Raylene, the girl was asleep, wrists cuffed to the bedrail for her own safety, for dripping something that kept her sedated. The baby was gone, whisked to NICU observation, though the nurse admitted quietly that nothing was wrong with him. Mara touched Raylene's cheek, whispered sorry, and left before the sheriff's deputies could find her. She drove west on autopilot, past Charleston, past the Ohio line, trying to outrun the smell of gasoline and burning hair that clung to her skin no matter how many times she showered. In a daze and outside Columbus she spread the contents of her camera card across the bed, hundreds of photographs, hours of audio, the scanned pages from the trunk. She uploaded everything to a cloud drive, wrote a frantic 4,000-word draft titled The House That America Forgot, and scheduled it to publish in 72 hours if she didn't log in to stop it. That night the humming returned, softer now, almost tender, coming from inside her own mouth when she breathed. She woke at 3:07 a.m. with her tongue swollen and numb, tasting iron. In the bathroom mirror her reflection lagged half a second behind. When she lifted her shirt she found faint bruises blooming across her ribs in the exact pattern of Lorna's fused fingers. The next morning she tried to delete the scheduled article. The cursor froze. The screen filled with a single photograph she had never taken, Mara at age 7, standing on the porch of the Whitaker house in a dress she didn't remember owning, smiling with teeth already too sharp. Behind her, generations of the family waved, faces blurred except for their eyes, every one of them the pale, drifting blue she now saw in her own reflection. She drove back east without deciding to. The highway signs felt familiar in the way dreams feel familiar. By dusk she was on the dirt spur again, the burned shell of the house rising black against the ridgeline, still smoking though 48 hours had passed. The front door hung open on melted hinges. Inside, the fire had burned selectively. Walls were gone, yet the family Bible lay untouched on its lectern, pages open to the genealogy. A new name had been added at the bottom in fresh red ink, Mara Ellison Whitaker, born the day she first arrived, married to the house itself. Beside it, in her own handwriting she did not remember, a single line, "Welcome home, cousin. Blood always finds the way back." The humming rose, warm now, maternal, coming from everywhere and nowhere, and Mara knelt in the ashes, pressed her forehead to the charred floorboards, and felt the last piece click into place. She had never been the rescuer. She had been the last pure strain they were waiting for, the reason no one had ever truly escaped. The house had simply been patient, keeping its hunger alive through centuries of careful, deliberate rot, until someone with untainted blood walked close enough to taste.